good evening, everybody. As everybody's registering slowly, we'll make a couple of housekeeping announcements to commence our webinar tonight. I have two wonderful people to talk to, and I'll introduce them more formally in a few moments. In the meantime, of course, the topic tonight is political correctness gone mad, its impact on church and family, and issues of cancel culture and wokeness and what have you. So it will be a very, very topical discussion tonight. Can I just, by way of introduction, also just mention that tonight your host will be myself. I'm the national webinar host and director of New South Wales, and David DeLima will join me shortly. He's going to assist me with the Q&A. He's our South Australian director as well. Now, if I may, I just want to do some advertising. Our next topic will be on the 8th of November, and it will be Dr. David Adler and Senator Erica Betts, and we're going to be talking about understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what impact it has on our freedoms. So please make sure you register for that, and it's on our website and available for you now. And that should be a very, very interesting night of discussion. Well, let me just sort of say, I'm also doing some more advertising, Kevin. See the things I do for you. Christianity is Good for Us by Kevin Donnelly. This will be launched tomorrow night with John Anderson and the former Deputy Prime Minister and George Cardinal Pell. This will be on Tuesday, 26th of October at 6:30 p.m. Now you can register, and I suggest you go to inquiries@wilkinsonpublishing.com.au and get the details on how to register, or come back to me and I will send you the link. Kevin, I'm really looking forward to reading that book. Is Christianity Good for Us? It certainly is, and I'll look forward to, I've booked in for the webinar tomorrow night as well, Kevin.
Thank you.
Now, cancel culture, we've got two book giveaways today. One is Cancel Culture, Political Correctness Destroying Free Speech and Western Civilization by Kevin Donnelly. That will be one of the book giveaways tonight, and I'll show you how you can be a winner. The second book is, of course, second giveaway book is by Bettina Arndt, the Me Too movement. So this will be very interesting. It's great reading, and Bettina will be giving away a copy of that as well. Can I say that the way we'll give it away is both Kevin and Bettina will pick the best questions they thought that were being asked on the night, and I will make sure that you get a copy. But they are wonderful reading, so please make sure you get that. Okay, let's get into it very quickly. Have a look at this. 10 years ago, the BBC dropped the use of the term before Christ and Anno Domini because they thought it was inappropriate. The European Parliament stopped using the title Miss or Mrs. The manhole term became referred to as a personal access unit. The UK Council banned the term brainstorming and replaced it with thought showers because it may offend epileptics. Blackboards became chalkboards, and schools got rid of the Christmas trees that have a holiday tree, and they replaced Merry Christmas with Happy Holidays. This is what we've been facing 10 years ago, and the situation's got worse, as you will hear in a moment. Let me just quickly say that Australians say that political correctness has gone too far, and 2/3 of Australians believe that political correctness has gone so far that it's indeed across all age groups that people think it's just gone mad. And as you can see, that little cartoon excerpt, it says that we are facing a determined enemy who's striving through all means to destroy the West and snuff out traditions of free thought, free speech, and freedoms of religion. Make no mistake, if we fail, we will be enslaved. May I please introduce Bettina Arndt and Dr. Kevin Donnelly, who are our guest speakers tonight. Each speaker will talk for about 15 minutes, and then after they've both spoken, we'll go into a Q&A session and make sure that we get your questions answered. May I welcome Bettina Arndt, well-known commentator. Bettina, over to you to start the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome. I'm very pleased to be here, and thanks to Greg for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to be on this panel, my little panel with Kevin for this event. I think I'm actually the perfect person to speak about cancel culture because, of course, I've recently been cancelled after a 45-year career in the Australian media, writing for all our major newspapers and appearing pretty much every week on television and radio. I've been totally deplatformed. Of course, I'm still here advocating for men, as I've done for the last few decades, and I certainly have no plans to go away. But I hope you'll indulge me if I tell my own story about what has happened, which really illustrates what's going on in our broader culture when noisy minority left-wing groups are succeeding in silencing anyone who challenges their narrative. So for the past 6 years, I've been writing articles and speaking out about the manufactured campus rape crisis being promoted by feminist activists. The goal of their campaign was to bully our universities into setting up regulations to adjudicate rape on campus. The result was secretive kangaroo courts, which use lower standards of proof and remove the legal rights of the accused to ensure more conviction in date rape cases. And what this was all about is the feminists have long been frustrated that juries are reluctant to convict young men in these he said, she said date rape cases when they don't know whom to believe. And their answer was to set up a separate court system, hidden from public view, deciding these cases using believe the victim justice. And it all started in America with Joe Biden, who proudly declared he was happy to use campuses for this sort of social engineering. We need a fundamental change in our culture, he said. And the quickest way to change culture is to change it on the campuses of America. As vice president in the Obama administration, he used Title IX anti-discrimination rules to force all universities to set up tribunals to adjudicate sexual misconduct. Thousands of accused young men have been thrown out of colleges, their education derailed by biased tribunal investigations. And the result has been numerous civil suits, over 400 so far, where their families have sued the universities, usually successfully, for failure to protect their due process rights. Trump's education secretary, Betsy DeVos, introduced some reforms to the system, but Joe Biden has been desperate to wind these back. Within hours of gaining power, he was making moves to ensure these unjust tribunals could revert to business as usual, meaning any male accused of sexual misconduct is hung out to dry. Meanwhile, down in Australia, our own campus activists have diligently followed the American Sisterhood's copybook. As in America, it started off with fake statistics suggesting a campus rape crisis. We actually had the Human Rights Commission in Australia, and they conducted $1 million survey, which failed to find any real evidence of a crisis. Only 0.8% of students reported any time of sexual assault each year that was studied. And this included incidents like a grope from a stranger on the train to uni. The commission disguised these really disappointing results by claiming widespread sexual violence, which was actually low-grade harassment like unwanted staring. But our mainstream media promoted this narrative of rampant sexual violence, and our university was bullied into setting up this huge industry, supporting security committees, running our own kangaroo courts. I spent a whole year conducting a campus tour, speaking out about this fake rape crisis, which was actually pretty hair-raising because the feminist activists tried desperately to stop me. It had a really positive outcome. When the riot squad had to be called in to protect me and my audience from violent protesters at Sydney University, the government established an inquiry into campus free speech, which led to the Free Speech Code, which governing these institutions, which has just been locked in. But universities across the country are still operating these secretive committees, usurping criminal law to adjudicate sexual assault, with devastating results from young men concerned. I have a team of lawyers working pro bono to help the steady stream of male students dealing with these sorts of ordeals. I mean, these kids are being thrown out of uni within hours of an accusation. They have their degrees withheld, their education derailed. It's such a shameful process. So I've been out there for the last few years trying to expose what's going on here. And we've been making some real progress. But behind the scenes, the feminist activists working really hard to stop me, to damage my reputation, clearly nervous that I might succeed in undermining their achievement in pushing the universities to set up this whole apparatus. My really big mistake last year was to accept an honours award from the government, which gave the mob a means of attacking me. I've been self-employed for decades, and the feminists had no way of ruining my career or forcing me out of a job. But within hours of the honours award being announced, the activists were circulating maliciously edited material deliberately designed to discredit me and wheeling out all these eminent people to demand the award be rescinded. And it was all led by one woman in particular, one of the founders of End Rape on Campus, Nina Fennell. She'd actually already published a whole series of damaging articles, which selectively quoted from my videos and articles, seeking to misrepresent my views. For instance, one of the things that made me really mad, you may remember the horrible rape and murder of a La Trobe student called AM Masawi. Well, Fennell linked that crime to my campus tour. Fennell also spent 2 years trying to prove I misrepresented my psychology qualifications. She used social media to recruit people to make complaints about me to the health regulator. So 3 times this regulatory body has decided there's no cause for action against me. It's all pretty complicated. I actually trained as a clinical psychologist at a time when registration didn't exist. And I never bothered to register because within months I gave up my clinical work to be involved in working full-time in the media. But Fennell's most powerful weapon came in the form of a heavily edited extract from a video I made with a Tasmanian teacher. His name is Nicholas Bester, and he was imprisoned for having sex with a student, Grace Tame, who's now Australian of the Year. I made that video with Bester after he'd been released from prison and a local judge spoke out, condemning the vigilante campaign that was being conducted by local feminists trying to stop him completing a PhD at the University of Hobart. And this campaign, Tangled Webs, this campaign was actually orchestrated by End Rape on Campus activists. I made it really clear in that interview I condemned Bester's behaviour. I got him to say he deserved being sent to prison, but that video has been carefully edited to suggest I endorsed his actions. And Nina Fennell has campaigned to allow Grace Tame to be allowed to speak out. She removed a law which protected the identity of victims of sex crimes. So as soon as Tame was given a public platform, she joined Fennell in presenting misinformation about me and has launched numerous attacks on me, including criticism of Amanda Stoker, for instance, who has supported my campus activities in the past. It was always obvious I'd receive the Honours Award, which happened at the end of last year, because they don't remove awards simply because some people dislike opinions that others, because you're expressing opinions that some people don't like. Essentially, you actually have to commit a criminal offence to have an Honours Award removed from you. But for me, the media pile was absolutely ferocious, including attacks from almost all sectors of our media, 2 attorneys general, and most of the Australian Senate, which voted for a motion which misrepresented a comment I made about the dreadful Hannah Clark murder. I expressed support for the police spokesman who was running the case and quoted his words, but the Senate wrongly claimed those words to be my own. I was very lucky because the onslaughts eventually stopped after a few months. I have to be one of the very few people in Australia who was really happy when COVID hit this country because it pushed me off the front pages, which was a really blessed relief, particularly as my family had by then come under attack. The whole thing was incredibly stressful, and particularly to me because none of the so-called advocates for free speech in this country came to my defence. It's been 20 months since I've appeared on Sky Media or had an article accepted in the Australian after writing for them for nearly 20 years. But I've been extremely busy. I set up a new group called Mothers of Sons, which used mothers to speak out about the injustices being experienced by their sons. We thought this might be a good idea. I mean, these are women. You know, surely the media was going to take notice of women. We're supposed to believe women, aren't we? But of course, the media totally ignored these amazing mothers. I mean, one of my women was a mum whose 18-year-old son had been accused of rape some years ago. Absolutely dreadful story. This whole family was put through the mill. The boy ended up in prison for a while. Eventually, his accuser was in court and her evidence unraveled in front of the court. She was found to have DNA from 2 other men in her vagina on the night in question, and not from the son of my friend, the mother. And amazingly, when that family walked out of that courtroom, the jury stood there applauding this young man because they were so horrified at what had happened what had happened to him as a result of this false accusation. We have dozens of stories from other mothers about what's happening to sons across Australia. What's intriguing to me, it seems to me that the shutdown on speaking honestly about gender issues is even more stringent than many other aspects of political correctness that attract all the attention. So every night we see identity politics issues discussed endlessly on Sky News or in News Limited papers, stories about the trans lobby or race issues, and no one is daring to call attention to the many ways feminism is distorting our society, endlessly changing laws, rules and regulations to favour women at the expense of men. And I just want to run through a few of these now. So last year, the feminist domestic violence industry achieved an astonishing 150% increase in their annual handout from the federal government, leaping from 100 to 250 million per year by falsely claiming there'd be a second pandemic of violence as a result of women being locked up with dangerous men. All the official statistics showed no such increase. We rightly hear a lot about Indigenous male violence, but no one talks about the fact that the second most dangerous group in our society are Indigenous women, who are more than twice as violent as men in general in Australia. 6 out of 8 people who kill themselves every day in Australia are men, and yet our official suicide prevention policy is gender neutral and fails totally to address the real reasons for male suicide. Recently, our eminent Sydney Silk and former public prosecutor Margaret Cunneen spoke out about how feminists are weaponising our criminal justice system. She explained how the traditional filtering system has been removed, which allowed police and prosecutors to determine which sexual assault cases had the evidence to stand up in court. As part of the new Believe Women Justice, all cases are now pushed through to court. Many fail, and then the activists scream blue murder that the system is letting down rape victims, and they demand more draconian measures to deny justice to accused men. Isn't that an incredible system? They really leave me reeling sometimes, the brilliance of the feminist movement. I'm sure some of you saw last year, schools were in trouble for shaming boys, but actually feminist ideology is rife throughout our school system, teaching boys to be ashamed of their toxic masculinity. I recently made a video with a former police officer talking about how police are really resenting being forced to enforce unjust laws, such as when women make false allegations of violence to remove men from their homes and deny them contact with their children. Over 60% of graduates are now female, and yet we still have policies pushing to get women into the very few subjects where they don't totally dominate. When are we going to address the imbalance here? Girls winning all the prizes at schools, boys dropping out, boys filling the remedial classes, failing to finish uni. It's now totally politically incorrect to want fair treatment for men and boys. And the feminists have done such a good job controlling the public agenda on this important issue that no one ever dares even talk about it. But we see the impact on our society with more broken marriages, fatherless families, damaged children. men resisting marriage, single women left stranded, and declining happiness in current generations of the most privileged women the world has ever seen. That's the legacy of feminism today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bettina. Some challenging commentary there, and we'll have a chance to go into question time. I'd like to hand over now to Kevin Donnelly. Kevin, over to you. Let's look at political culture, cancel culture, and political correctness gone mad. Thank you, Kevin.
My pleasure, Greg. And I assume you can hear me and see me.
All good.
Everything's working. Wonderful. And thank you for having me on the Zoom meeting tonight. And wonderful always to hear Bettina talking about her shocking experiences and a living example, if I can say this, of how cruel and how unfair cancel culture is, political correctness. But firstly, there are many other examples of political correctness, and you quoted some at the start here. I mean, coon cheese, you might remember earlier this year, ridiculous, had to change the name. The First Fleet is described as an invasion, even worse, I think, because in 1788, this was a foundation, the beginning of a foundation of a nation, which I think so many people have come to support and to love and to benefit from. But the First Fleet is Invasion Day. The arrival of Europeans led to genocide. Now, I'm the first to understand, reading about the issue, a lot of Aboriginal people were unfairly treated. There were examples of violence and frontier warfare, but it was never a genocide. But that's how far cancel culture and political correctness go. Captain Cook, one of the greatest explorers and discoverers that I've ever read about, and on his voyages around the world a number of times, he really charted Australia, New Zealand, obviously. A great man, a great navigator, and he's now, his statues in Sydney are being graffitied. I reviewed the national curriculum in 2014, and when I looked at history, that's another example. I mean, even more recently, the revised curriculum that was introduced in May this year, it really airbrushes Christianity. It takes away from our history any sense of Western culture, Western civilization, Judeo-Christianity. It's all about prioritising Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander history, spirituality, and it's a great shame. I mean, it's actually an example of how political correctness, like in George Orwell, 1984, where Winston rewrites history in the Ministry of Truth, as they call it. It's an example of how history is being rewritten before our very eyes. I mean, all of your viewers will remember, I'm sure, Israel Folau, what happened to him, one of our great rugby union players. He was vilified, attacked, eventually lost his position in the team because he simply made public his views from the Bible about homosexuality. Margaret Court, one of the greatest tennis players, and I'll call her a woman tennis player. I'm all in favour of being gender specific. She similarly was attacked and vilified. So Christianity, because of political correctness in particular, is being attacked and vilified. And when you think of cancel culture and political correctness, there are those modern or recent examples. But what I've been doing over the last few years is to look at where it all started and relying on a number of other people, including the Italian political philosopher, Augusto de Noce. If you go back in history to the 1920s in Germany at the Frankfurt School, you have the origin of what is now called political correctness, cancel culture. It's really a neo-Marxist inspired ideology. And people think, well, we have to be fair, we have to be reasonable, be politically correct, treat people with fairness, impartiality. In fact, it's more than that. It's a calculated, orchestrated campaign that began in the 1920s and 1930s, an ideology found on critical theory, an ideology, as I say, and I'll just quote from Del Noce here. He argues, quote, it promoted a revolutionary ideology, a process of liberation from any form of authority, theological, human, or transcendent, or empirical. So what you have with classical Marxism is a view that capitalist society has to be overthrown by taking control of the modes and means of production. But what happened with the Frankfurt School, we moved to cultural Marxism or neo-Marxism, which is about the culture wars. It's about getting the long march through the institutions, as the Antonioni Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, argued many years ago, that you had to overthrow capitalism by taking control of schools, universities, the church, the family. And so when you look at this idea of cancel culture, which is in the news almost every week, the important thing to understand is it really began with the 1920s, the Frankfurt School, the idea, a neo-Marxist view of overthrowing capitalism and actually ridding our history, Western culture, our history of Christianity. Now, some of you who are watching will remember, obviously, Karl Marx talked about religion being the opium of the masses. Antonio Gramsci actually talked about, and again, I'll just quote him here, Antonio Gramsci argued that you had to abolish Christianity. You had to, and I'll just quote, rid the Western world of Christianity. Because what you have with neo-Marxism is the idea that you can make a man-made utopia. So the city of man replaces the city of God. And that is a fundamental point to make here, because instead of believing in any sense of the transcendent or the spiritual, instead of listening to God's word or Jesus in the New Testament, the Bible is obviously only a text which is deconstructed in terms of privilege and white power and misogyny. And Bettina talks about the impact of feminism here, but it even goes to the extent that when you read the Bible, it's misogynist, it's patriarchal, it's Eurocentric, it's about white supremacism, and you deconstruct it. So what happened is that the view now with critical theory, with neo-Marxism, is that Christianity is airbrushed. And it's a bit like George Orwell, as I said. When I reviewed the national curriculum in 2014, it was obvious that what was happening in history from kindergarten or prep to year 10 was that Christianity was actually airbrushed over hundreds and hundreds of descriptors or references. There were many to Aboriginal culture, history, spirituality, even in mathematics and science, where they talk about Indigenous algebra and Indigenous science, which I'm quite not sure about. I mean, when I hop on a plane, I hope it's European physics and engineering that keeps the plane going up in the air. But when you look at the national curriculum, it prioritises Indigenous, and Christianity is undermined and ignored in history, but also in civics. Some of the research I've looked at shows that over 40–50% in Australia of those institutions, organisations, whether it's health, education, social welfare, over 40–50% are Christian-based or Christian in origin or managed. But in the civics curriculum, when it talks about social welfare, about reciprocity, about the need to look after the disadvantaged, the underprivileged, Christianity isn't not mentioned at all. So it's a real problem here that Western civilization and Judeo-Christianity has been attacked. And like Bettina mentioned, anybody who questions political correctness, cancel culture, is vilified and attacked. People like Peter Ridd, the academic at James Cook University, lost his job. Israel Folau could no longer play rugby for Australia. But even more importantly here, and it's an argument that people haven't really addressed, to be in an academic institution or even a private corporation now, like Westpac or BHP, to get promotion, to be accepted, you have to be woke. You have to have taken the Kool-Aid, as they say, and be prepared to accept this ideology. And anybody who condemns it or criticises it, and luckily I'm at the Australian Catholic University, where we have endorsed the free speech code that the government has endorsed, I'm safe. But so many people now are losing their jobs, are not being promoted, are not getting their work published. And it's a great shame, because what I'd like to think in a Western liberal democracy, that we have the freedom. And I'll finish by saying a great book I read a couple of years ago, Larry Seidentrop, talked about the origins of liberty. So when you look at our political and our legal institutions in Western countries, and it goes back to the Glorious Revolution, to common law, to Magna Carta, it was fundamentally informed and nourished by Christianity, by the admonition to love thy neighbour as thyself. And when you look at what Jesus spoke, he spoke about the inherent dignity of the person, the fact that we're all made in God's image. And what Larry Seidentrop traces, the impact on Christianity of early Rome, was to actually fundamentally change Western culture, Western civilization. And thank God in Australia, we've inherited that. So two of the first books that arrived with the First Fleet were the Bible, King James Bible, but also the book on common law. And so we inherited, even from 1788, this Christian infused view of our political and our legal systems. And as T.S. Eliot, the poet, says, our literature, our culture, our architecture is fundamentally informed by Christianity. So it's something we should nourish and acknowledge. And I was pleased to see only last week, Alan Tudge, the Education Minister, has finally got into the debate and argued that the new national curriculum should acknowledge Christianity and Western civilization. It's not enough to prioritise Aboriginal or Indigenous history. We have to understand that the primary reason our nation is such a prosperous, until COVID, but such a prosperous, peaceful country with this stability is because of Christianity, as well as the Enlightenment and the concept of common law and being rational and liberalism. So I think it's great, Greg, that you're getting these arguments out there, because if we vacate the field, we've already lost the battle. So as we used to say in the 60s, dare to struggle, dare to win. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Kevin. Wonderful commentary, and we'll get back to you. Got some questions coming in. Now, while my colleague David DeLima will ask some questions in a moment, Bettina, I'll ask the first one from you, if I may. As you know, cancel culture within universities is rife. It used to be the bastion of free speech. It no longer is. Bettina, when they talk about male, female, do you think they're talking about, what are the issues with transgenderism? I mean, it's hard to know who's a male and female these days. How do you find that struggle, Bettina?
Oh, I think that's one of the most worrying lobby groups is the trans lobby, because I don't even speak for the majority of trans people. I mean, I back in my old days, because I started out my work as a sex therapist back in the 1970s, and I was very involved in people with all sorts of different sexual orientations and so on, including transsexual people. And I know from I've been kept up on this area a bit, and there are many trans people who object to the way their lives being taken over by this politics of this lobby group, because they just want to be able to, make a decision about the gender that they want to live with and get on with their lives, live private lives. They don't want to have this group speaking for them and pulling down our traditional concept of what gender is all about and biological sex. I mean, it's nonsensical, the arguments of this particular group, and I think they're extremely dangerous.
Thank you, Bettina. David, can I pass over to you?
Greg, sorry for my late appearance tonight, but I'll ask the first question of Bettina, if I may. Bettina, is the feminist movement changing at all in regard to men and their problems?
Oh, I unfortunately believe that the feminist movement is getting worse and has a ever more worrying grip on all our major institutions. I mean, I started off as a feminist and I believed in equality between men and women. And it was only when feminism really shifted to something beyond that. I think we actually achieved most of the goals that were really important for women in this country, 20 years ago. And ever since, it's not been about achieve, a level playing field. It's been very much about advancing women at the expense of men. And it's only getting worse. I mean, every week there's some other area where feminists are influencing the law or putting in gender quotas. At the moment, I'm making a video about a 50% quota in our fire brigade. The fire services are trying to get 50% women, which is lunacy. I mean, this is, and it's all about the fact that, this is seen as one of the last bastions of, a career which involves real male strength and courage and, a lot of the things we've always admired men for. And therefore the feminists are determined to pull that down. And they've introduced quotas to ensure more and more women get through. They're ensuring more and more women get promoted. And yet women are really struggling in that job. I mean, there are some women who do a terrific job and others who clearly don't have the strength to deal with the tough times. It's fine when they're going to a school and giving advice on handling fires, but when they're actually out there, like about horrendous bushfires, nearly 2 years ago, it's a very different story. So there are many areas where feminism is simply becoming more and more extreme, and it's extremely worrying to me.
And now, Bettina, you've written in the past about harms done to children who are not raised in the traditional family, that is with a married mother and father. Is there any debate left about that situation, or is the argument so badly lost that it's no longer worth pursuing?
In my mind, the research is very clear about the advantages for children in being in two-parent homes, the advantages of women for children in having a father in their lives and having a masculine element rather than just being raised by women. That research stands on its own, yet I think the battle has been lost. I've been writing for decades about the way the narrative has been promoting single motherhood as a very positive alternative to the two-parent family. That's had a grip on all our soap operas and our movies and our magazine articles. They no longer even ask people if they ever have any interest in getting married if it's a pregnant celebrity. There are so many aspects of this that are really worrying, and to even talk about it means you're howled out. It's a classic area where you can't have any proper debate anymore.
Kevin, just a quick one from you. You alluded to the fact that political correctness is a term used by the Marxist regimes, but it actually means following the party line. Kevin, from a current perspective, what is the purpose of political correctness? Is it to undermine the Western civilization? Is it to, I mean, there are a lot of intelligent men, I'm assuming, and women in Parliament. Why aren't they taking up arms against these issues?
There are one or two, and I think Bettina mentioned Amanda Stoker. I mean, there are one or two politicians. John Anderson, who was Deputy Prime Minister.
Claire Chandler too, I think Senator Claire Chandler.
In Tasmania, absolutely. And she's arguing very much against transgenderism. John Anderson has a YouTube regular interviews with various people from around the world and Australia. I mean, I worked for a while in Canberra and actually Chief of Staff to Kevin Andrews under the Howard government. And John Howard, when he was Prime Minister, made the point that we need to engage in the battle of ideas. You can forget the Machiavellian idea of politics and about doing the numbers. And I mean, that's part of it. But John Howard always believed in the battle of ideas, as did Sir Robert Menzies, who had a very Christian philosophy here in terms of what politics was about and serving the nation and the people. There are a few politicians, but the problem, to get back to your question, is that what the left or the cultural left has done so cleverly is to couch political correctness in terms of being fair, reasonable, not insulting anyone, not offending anyone. And the best example was the Safe Schools program I'm sure will know about, which was a gender fluidity program going into schools, primary and secondary, where they were teaching young kids as young as 8 and 10 that girls can be boys and boys can be girls, that sexuality and gender, which is a construct, by the way, gender, it all gets back to biology and your chromosomes. But they were teaching the young kids that it was fluid, limitless. Ros Ward, who helped design it, gave it away when she spoke at a socialist conference some years ago, where she admitted it's not about anti-bullying, it's not about tolerance. And the quote is marvellous, and I quote it in the book, that you mentioned at the start about the Less Long March. She actually admitted that it's wanting to overthrow the family, a Christian idea of the family, and to replace it with a Marxist view, which was empowering and liberating, and which would herald the utopia. Now, the only problem here is, as anyone who knows history, when you look at the Black Book of Communism, whether it's Lenin or Stalin or Mao or Pol Pot, this idea of the utopia has led to millions and millions and millions of people dying, being imprisoned, being tortured and starved. So the point is, and I think this is one that I try to detail in more in the book, and chapter 1 is written by a very good sociologist, Gary Marx, who traces it all back. It actually isn't about tolerance. And one of my heroines is Camille Paglia, the American non-binary feminist, who's quite radical, but she doesn't like feminism the way it's gone. She actually argues we're now living in a time where tolerance is no longer the way people engage. It's about an Orwellian view of groupthink, of mind control, of indoctrination, and that's happening in our schools, and that is a great concern.
Thank you, Kevin. David.
Yeah, question for Kevin. You've welcomed the remarks of Education Minister Alan Tudge last week, critiquing the national curriculum. Is he doing enough simply by making that critique, or should the government sack the curriculum authority, ACRA?
I'm very glad you asked that question, because I've written an article for the Daily Telegraph in Sydney, which should be in there tomorrow, where I make the point that Alan Tudge, who I know, And he did a lot of great work with Noel Pearson in Cape York for some years. And it's great that he came out publicly. But it's too little, too late. The reality is, I mentioned the review in 2014. Christopher Pyne was the education minister under a Liberal government. He ignored the recommendations, did nothing. And we recommended very strongly there be a greater focus on Western culture, on Judeo-Christianity. And Pyne did nothing. The problem is that the education establishment is like the ABC. It's riven with woke employees, the management. They're all drinking the Kool-Aid. And so a politician, a minister, can make an announcement. And I quote Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard from 2008. Gillard said, we will have a history curriculum, a national curriculum, which is impartial, balanced, which is not black armband, but not 3 cheers. She said, we will have a balance, 2008. It hasn't happened. It hasn't happened at all. In fact, it's now cancel culture on steroids, where you have Indigenous algebra, Indigenous science, and all the rest of it. So it's great that Alan Tudge has made that comment, that speech last week, but time will tell, because the history of education, as Bettina talked about before, the cultural left has taken the long march and they now run the agenda. And that's the great fear that I have, that unless people mobilise, be strategic. And I was fortunate enough to meet the late Bob Santa Maria, God bless him. And BA always said, we must engage in the battle. Take the fight up to the left. Don't just sit back.
Yep. Can I come in there?
Yep.
Yep. I mean, I absolutely take your point, Kevin, because politicians are always saying to me, we never hear from the other side. They hear from the feminists all the time on the issues I'm talking about, and who absolutely dominate the public narrative. And they desperately need all of us, quiet Australians, to get off our bottoms and get active and flood them with letters and talk to them and talk in the newspaper comment section and make our voices heard. We remember all this earlier this year was this manufactured campaign around the rape crisis in Canberra and the politicians, one rape case after another. It was all an attack, deliberately orchestrated attack on the government, of course. And we, at Mothers of Sons, we put together a draft letter, They Don't Speak for Me. And we got as many women as we could to write to MPs. We're using this draft letter saying, Australia is a very safe country for women. This is all manufactured nonsense to suggest that our criminal justice system is failing women. I mean, putting the facts together about the very low incidence of rape in this country, about the fact that most Australian men treat their women well, and so on. And we got as many people as we could to send that out. We need to do this all the time. And whether it's people writing individual letters or orchestrating, draft letters that people can send in if they're if they're uncomfortable doing that. But our voices are just not good enough to be quiet Australians. We have to be noisy Australians.
A silent majority. David.
Yes, a question for Bettina. Is the family court doing justice to men? Or what is happening to family law in Australia?
Oh, it's been one of the really... Funny enough, family law was the reason I got involved in advocating for men. I was sitting at my desk like 30 years ago, and I got a letter in those days, and before emails, I got a letter from a retiring family court judge, and I'd written a little bit about the problems that were emerging in terms of unfair treatment of men. And he said, you're so right. We made a huge mistake in giving too much power to the custodial parent, who at that time was almost always women, and many women are misusing that power. And he gave me a whole series of interviews, and I spent decades writing about family court. I was John Howard was very interested in this area, and he, funnily enough, got me on the government committees really advocating for men, to be another voice to present the other point of view, because of course on these committees were these powerful women's groups who just mowed down the very feeble men's groups we had operating at the time. And so they put me in there to get involved in some of the decision making. Howard made an enormous difference to family law. He introduced essentially a presumption of shared custody for parents, but to have equal care of their children after divorce. And of course, as soon as the coalition lost power, Labor came in again and played what I call the violence card. They started talking more and more about the dangers of women, of children ending up with violent fathers, and they introduced more and more elements in family law to protect children from violence, which meant that all a woman needs to do is allege she's afraid that her husband could be violent, and she has all the cards. And that has been operating ever since. Our family law is in a hopeless mess. Every day, fathers are just done over in the court. They have to spend all their earnings to try to protect themselves from false allegations. My mothers, many of whom have adult sons who've lost all their money trying to gain access to their kids through family court battles. And these grandmothers are spending their own retirement money to try to help their sons see their grandchildren. I mean, it's in dire strait, our family court system.
Gone mad. David?
Okay, a question for Kevin. How come parents have lost control of the education of their children at state schools? And how can parents regain control of the education system?
That's a very difficult question, in a sense that parents increasingly are finding it difficult, I think, you know, given the economic situation we're in and COVID, and but even before then, if you're in one of the Sydney, Melbourne, one of the big cities, you generally got two parents both working. They're often time poor. But the reality is, and Julia and I, we were very strong on this, parents are their children's first educators. Parents have the primary responsibility for educating their children. And so parents should be very active. And whether it's simple things like turning off the computer or not having, kids in the bedroom with iPhones and iPads and all this new digital technology, whether it's reading to kids with a printed book, whether it's getting them outside and playing cricket or footy or netball or whatever, parents need to be more active. They also need to take an interest in their kids' education, and that means finding out what's happening in the school. And a lot of parents still do this. They'll talk to the teacher or the principal. And I think more and more that happened, interestingly enough, over the last year and a half with COVID, because a lot of parents with kids being in virtual classrooms at home, parents have contacted me and said, why are my kids reading this material on screen? Why are they being asked to study this? So there is, I would hope, a bit of a move here for parents to get more involved. They need to get up to the school, they need to talk to the teacher, they need to talk to the principal. It's interesting, certainly in Queensland, there's been a large increase in homeschooling, and that's something that I think will only increase with COVID, because a lot of parents have had their kids at home. It has worked. They have taken greater control. When you look at some of the research in the surveys, often the reason why parents are worried about school education is that they think their kids are going to schools, certainly, and I hate to say it, within the government system, where they have programs like Safe Schools. It's all about gender fluidity. It's all about denigrating boys. As we all know, only recently boys were made to stand up at school in Melbourne and Sydney and apologise for being men or being boys. So parents will find it difficult. but they have a responsibility there. And I hope that will increase in terms of homeschooling. If you go back 5 or 6 years, most of the material in homeschooling was from America, but increasingly now it's homegrown. So I think that's a good thing as well. But as a parent, be informed, be active, and actually get involved with your children. Sit around the table, have dinner, talk to them, turn off all the screens, and actually relate to them and share that wonderful thing, which only a parent will know, of raising your children.
Kevin, I'll try not to laugh as I read this question. Will the people continue to imbibe the Kool-Aid woke cancel culture indefinitely, or will it eventually be spat out?
It's fascinating when you look at history, and I was reading C.S. Lewis recently, the Screw Tape Letters again. And if you go back over history, there have always been times when Christianity has been under attack, under threat. And whether it goes back to the time Jesus walked on this earth, or whether it's more recently with cancel culture and political correctness, I have a great belief in human nature, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I think people, especially young people, do have a thirst for a sense of the spiritual, of the transcendent. I think it was Pope Paul who argued, we are human, we are flawed, we are created half to rise and half to fall, as I think Alexander Pope said. But at the same time, we have a thirst for trying to find out why we're here. Who are we? Where are we going? How do we live the good life? How do we relate to people? How do we commit to the common good? How do we find fulfillment and happiness? And I think, you know, Australians in particular have a good, as the Americans would say, I don't want to be offensive, but the Americans would say, have a good crap detector. We know when we're being fed rubbish. And it's interesting at the last federal election, especially in Queensland, north of Brisbane, but also Western Sydney and parts of Melbourne, a lot of people who won the election for Morrison and the Liberal government were people who didn't want ideology, political correctness, cancel culture. They didn't like the look of Bill Short. They didn't like what the Greens were saying, what the ALP policy was in terms of education, gender, transgenderism, all the rest of it. So I'm a bit optimistic, and one of the good signs for me is Campion College in Sydney, which is a liberal arts college that Cardinal Pell helped to establish. That is now embarking on a very big building program, multi-million dollars, because their enrolments are going up and up and up. And the fact that so many people voted for Scott Morrison is also a positive. And finally, about 68%, if you can believe it, of ABC viewers and listeners voted in a survey, Australia Talks. 68% said political correctness has gone too far and we have to get rid of it. So I just keep the fingers crossed, and with God's grace and a bit of common sense, things might get better.
Thank you, David. And we'll have to pretty much end it there because we've reached our hour limit type of thing. You have both been generous with your time, Bettina. It's so good to hear you talk, and Kevin, absolutely very informative as well. Bettina, one word, what advice do you have for men in this current persecution that they are facing? A couple of words, Bettina. Stay strong.
No, well, it's a bit difficult. I mean, reach out. There are people who will help, whether you're a student being accused at a university or a guy, you know, we have good groups. Dads in distress, now it's called Parents Beyond Breakup, to help dads going through divorce. We you know, there are resources there, and I just really worry that men are so vulnerable when they get isolated, and they need more support.
Thank you, Bettina. Look, we're going to close in prayer, and I'll ask David to do that, and then I'll finish off formally. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Greg. And Bettina and Kevin, thank you so much for your input tonight. It's been fantastic, and really appreciate the optimism that's coming through, as well as the resilience. And Kevin, you've mentioned the great Bartholomew Augustine Santa Maria, and he would often quote Gramsci, not that we'd agree with most of what Gramsci stood for, but he would often quote Gramsci, and whose motto was pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And I think that's a very helpful comment from the late, great Bob Santa Maria. So with those thoughts in mind, let's just commit our nation to God in prayer. Our Father, we thank you for Australia, for its Christian heritage, for its peace and prosperity. And we pray for Bettina and for Kevin and for FamilyVoice and others who are speaking up to try to resist the tide. And we do pray for your strengthening to be upon Bettina, who's suffered so greatly, and Kevin, we thank you for that he still seems to have some opportunity in the media, and be with FamilyVoice as we continue to raise these issues as well. So we commit each other now, and all of our listeners and participants, we hope that they'll be strengthened by what's been shared, and ask that your blessing be upon us in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody. This is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel in about a week's time. Bettina, Kevin, thank you so much. On behalf of the Governing Board of FamilyVoice Australia, we thank you for your time. I thank everybody that joined us tonight. There's a lot of questions unanswered. I will send those to you, Kevin and Bettina, and you can decide to answer those, and I'll pass them on. The winners of the book are, I'm hoping, of Philip C. and Margaret B. I will be in touch. You'll get a copy of Bettina's book and one of Kevin's as well. Good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.